to introduce Professor Moses Khisa, who is no stranger to I think any of us. He's a graduate of Makerere. He is a professor of political science in, I gather, the School of Public and International Affairs at North Carolina State University. And in addition to his many articles and academic publications, he's also a frequent contributor to the Ugandan Press, in the Monitor, and I guess formerly of the Observer. I don't, and in a tradition from Makerere of public scholarship that is really very important and admirable. So, but I think the reason why he's here in our history seminar is that he's presenting a paper that involves a bit of historical material that situates the history of the state and militarism in sort of a political science framing. And I think as historians, I think we thought it would be a useful venue for him to present and get feedback from the department. And I should just mention that it's this paper he's presenting is for a edited collection that I have the pleasure of being one of the co-editors on. And he already received very fantastic positive reviews from the reviewers, but wanted, I think, so whatever advice we can give him will be, I think, just helping to make this an even stronger paper for this volume, which I'll be advertising when it comes out. So with that, I think everyone here I know. I'm Edgar Taylor, a lecturer in the Department of History, Archaeology, and Heritage Studies. And with that, it's my pleasure to hand it over to Dr. Khisa. Thank you for.
All right. Okay. Am I sharing my screen?
Yes.
You see my screen?
Yes, we can see it.
You can see my screen?
Yes. Yeah.
Perfect. Okay, good. I was somehow, thinking that I haven't yet set it up. I have two screens in my office, and sometimes they confuse me. I'm not too sure which one. And does everybody hear me well?
I can hear you.
You can hear me? Okay, all right. Well, first of all, Edgar, I want to thank you very much and the department for your very kind invitation. Makerere is very close to my heart as my alma mater, and it's always a pleasure to return home. I wish that we're meeting under better circumstances and in person. Unfortunately, the pandemic has turned our lives upside down, and I have to be speaking to you, in Raleigh from my office. I wish I was speaking at Makerere. The last time I spoke in 2018, it was a great honor to be back home and speaking on the campus, which was very important in my formative life as a scholar. So I wanted to begin off briefly by sort of stewarding this talk, this paper, and my broad interest in these issues. So I've been working on a project on civil-military relations, part of which has been published in a special issue of the journal Civil Wars, which I think you can see there on the screen. And we have a forthcoming edited volume on civil-military relations in Africa as well, that is due perhaps by the end of this year with Lynn Rayner. But I'm also broadly interested in the history of ideas and the politics of knowledge production. That's why I was very thrilled by the invitation from Edgar and from the department for me to speak on the subject of the state and the scholar as I have framed it. Let me begin by flagging up front sort of my main interest here in terms of the question that I'm trying to address, which is, how do we understand the relationship between the state and state power and the project of decolonizing knowledge? And more specifically, I'm interested in understanding what it means to decolonize knowledge when both the state and the society are built on a foundation of militarism. So I'm going to sort of give an initial heads up argument that is in the paper, and sort of make the conclusion, and then I'll walk back to the details and the analysis that I make in this paper. So I basically want to argue that decolonizing knowledge and pursuing critical scholarship requires an enabling environment which is considerably dependent on the nature of the state and the political atmosphere in a country. Scholarly productivity and publishing requires financial resources, but it is also crucial that there is a space for free pursuit of ideas and questions, especially those that hold state power accountable, and questions that ask, very, critical issues affecting society. What I argue in this paper is that it's not possible under conditions of militarism for knowledge to be decolonized, where the force of arms buttresses state power and the political culture is rooted in coercion. Scholarly productivity is heavily constrained when the overarching worldview of the most powerful actor in a country, the president, and the institutional texture of the most powerful institution, the state, are fundamentally militaristic. In other words, when there is an overriding belief in military power and reliance on force of arms as the primary source and guarantor of authority. I do, circle back and, come across an important quote from Rajab Nyogi, who noted more than half a century ago that the trouble in Africa is that we have too few intellectuals, people who will refuse to put their personal interests before intellectual honesty. Now, I want to temper that comment by Nyogi a little bit and suggest that human beings are wired to be risk averse, to seek self-preservation and prioritize personal well-being over lofty societal interests and grandiose agendas. In that regard, it is instructive that some of the leading and most influential Ghanaian intellectuals in recent decades have deliberately, if carefully, steered clear of directly confronting some of the key questions in Ugandan politics today. Many scholars have refrained from writing about hot-button social questions like nepotism and a cynically skewed and quasi-military regime and the blatant land grabbing that arguably promises to be the next frontier of social conflict in Uganda. What I argue here is that decolonizing knowledge has to go beyond methodological and epistemological concerns. It must entail the question of the state, the uses and abuses of state power. To decolonize knowledge production necessarily requires democratizing the state, and democratizing the state means, among other things, demilitarizing political contestations and social relations in society. Only then can it be possible to attain the ideal of objective civilian control of the military. Only then can constructive civic engagement and critical scholarly intervention flourish without undue, overt, and covert intrusions of the state. Now, militarism, I propose in this paper, is necessarily antithetical to independence, thought, and freedom. And by militarism, I mean the overriding belief in military power and reliance on force of arms as the primary source and guarantor of authority. Here, the military is both the source, but also the symbol of social power. Now, the colonial state was founded on militarism, a feature carried forward by the colonial state, by the post-colonial state. The threat of coercion and the use of overt violence mediated relations between rulers and the ruled. And almost without exception, the implantation of the European colonial state in Africa, in the African continent, was underpinned by external interests rather than the aspirations of the colonized peoples. Colonialism as a project was disguised as civilizational, but which in reality sought to meet the material and imperial interests of European colonial powers and their citizens. What this meant is that the threat and use of force was crucial in pursuing external interests in Africa. The forcible manner of foisting colonial authority on the colonized peoples necessitated deployment of coercion, often blunt, brutal, and chilling. To exert control and achieve effective occupation of the colonized peoples necessitated the exercise of brute force because securing hegemony was without coercion was impossible. In other words, the colonial conquest project had to be brutal and forceful because the hegemonic project, as happened in Europe, was not possible. In other words, the ruling classes in the West, established control through hegemony, but when it came to the colonized peoples, it was dominance through force rather than hegemonic control. The military machinery of the colonial state was the fulcrum of colonial rule. This was because European colonial administrators had to deal with the native question. The native question, which entailed having to confront, often inhospitable and relentlessly restive colonial subjects. The military was set up as a tool of internal coercion and control, not as a force against external aggression and provision of national security. This meant that the military was not so much, this meant that the military, not so much the police force, performed law and order tasks. Mahmoud Mamdani has summarized the crux of the problem as native question, which is the dilemma of successfully imposing alien rule by a tiny minority of foreigners on majority restive natives. In dealing with the native question, colonial authorities devised two overlapping strategies. First, and for the most part, they resorted to outside mercenary-like soldiers with no relationship to the local population. And in the same vein, they often turned to marginal ethnic groups or the so-called warrior tribes who were regarded as less sophisticated and thus more naturally obedient in implementing commands and directives. This was to ensure that the military and which was the nucleus and fulcrum of colonial administration, executed authoritative commands without sensitivity to local social relations and familial considerations. The second strategy that colonial administrators adopted was to propagate an unfamiliarity culture between European administrators on the one hand and the military and local population on the other. It was critical that colonial policies and programs be executed through a system of arm's length relationship between white administrators and the armed forces and the lower level staff on the other hand. And these were, of course, non-white. In other words, it was a system of hierarchy and command built on a firm demarcation and the distance between colonial administrators, who were whites, and soldiers and lower level staff, who were non-whites, which was necessary to propagate white racial superiority and in order to sustain alien rule. The militarist and unaccountable nature of the colonial state became an important legacy and a key feature of the post-colonial state. This has had grave implications for knowledge production. In the case of Uganda, as I argue in this paper, since independence, the preeminence of militarism has inhibited the deepening of a tradition of independent and critical scholarship. Under militarism, the military is both a source and symbol of power, and militarism in Uganda took particularly an insidious tenor only a few years after independence. And since the late 1980s, Uganda has had a contradictory coexistence of a neoliberal economic order, along with the persistence of an illiberal political regime. It is a combined commitment to a neoliberal economic order and durable illiberal politics built on militarism. Over the past many decades, the country has experienced state-instigated limitations on scholarship, which invariably obstruct pursuing critical questions against the status quo, questions that I argue include questioning the uses and abuses of state power. Decolonizing knowledge must entail the reassertion of subjectivity and reclamation of independence of thought, which are a sine qua non for the emancipatory and liberation agendas that a society can pursue. Without cultivating a culture of independent scholarship and free thought, it is difficult to realize other agendas within the decolonizing project. To decolonize knowledge necessarily requires an environment that both allows but also enhances civic virtues of free discourse and unfettered deliberation from which different projects are possible. Yet, to be sure, the very essence of the African colonial state and the post-colonial state heavily constrains the flourishing of free thought and critical deliberation because colonial rule, and indeed by extension, post-colonial Africa, decolonization has been a project that must include undoing a colonially created atmosphere that inhibits citizens' civic space and undermines intellectual vitality. I argue that to overcome this, as I mentioned at the beginning, there has to be democratization of the state and demilitarization of civil society. Yet this is something that has remained elusive for much of the African continent since independence. Since independence, most African nations have yet to attain an environment that allows for the fullness of critical intellectual engagement with the crucial questions of the day. In the immediate post-independence Africa, the problem was framed as one of the public intellectual versus the scholar, with the public intellectual supposedly committed to national liberation and the nation-state project, while the scholar ostensibly concerned with scholarly productivity and professional excellence. Mahmoud Mamdani, who I want to quote again here, has summarized this as, in a rather stylized, if a binary way, in my view, as a divide between relevance and excellence, with relevance assigned to the public intellectual, while excellency is attributed to the scholar. I'm at pains, I have to argue, to understand the inherent contradiction between being a relevant public intellectual and an excellent scholar. In my view, drawing a line between relevance and excellence is a little superfluous. For scholarly relevance has to be anchored in some form of excellency. It has to be seen in the fidelity that the scholar pays to a minimum set of professional standards, even when defying orthodoxy. In the same vein, we cannot define scholarly excellency strictly in terms of academic standards without relevance to society. In other words, the point is not to seek one against the other, it is to marry both relevance and excellence. It is not a question of either or, but both. The public intellectual is only one because he or she has the scholarly grounding and the foundation upon which to speak to issues of social significance. Scholarly excellence in turn reflects public engagement through critical but measured intellectual intervention that is not mere populist pandering. This, to my understanding, is the crux of responsible citizenship expected of a scholar. It is the remit of a citizen intellectual who is especially needed in countries of the global south like Uganda. One way to understand the immediate post-independence crises that have afflicted the African continent is through the place of the African scholar and the challenge of knowledge production. For the most part, Africa's socio-economic and political dilemmas cannot be divorced from the quest for decolonizing knowledge. If the continent still wrestles with the crisis of national identity and state legitimacy, the African scholar still confronts the precarious balance between material survival and professional success, the trade-off between the public intellectual, the trade-off between free intellectual expression and personal preservation, between existence and excellency. Like many social problems in the continent, we can understand the question of knowledge production by analyzing the relationship between the state and the scholar. The nature of the former has implications for activities and actions of the latter. Before I get into the specific Ugandan case, I want to quickly run through a little bit of the historical intersection of militarism, colonialism, and its continuity in the post-colonial era. The continuation of imperial ambitions and the processes of capitalist accumulation in the post-colonial world, which have intensified with the acceleration of globalization, have had grave implications for how the global south is conceptualized, theorized, and studied. The central leitmotif was to view Africa through the European template, which is Eurocentrism, and the countries of the global south, and the countries of the global periphery are presented as working towards catching up with the West. This was as much in debates on development as in the pursuit of ideas and knowledge production. But I want to suggest that what is often neglected in many debates on knowledge production on the African continent is the central nervous system of the colonial and the post-colonial state, which is the military and militarism. If Eurocentrism places Africa in a Euro-American epistemological straitjacket, militarism necessarily inhibits meaningful scholarly engagement with the everyday questions of power, plunder, and pillaging at the center, that is at the center of Africa's socio-economic problems, both historically and in contemporary times. Colonialism, we must remember, was not just material conquest. It was also non-material subjugation. The cultural and intellectual violence, the distortion of African social ethos, folklore, belief systems, as well as the systematic construction of the native as an inferior and slavish subject were all part of the colonial project. The invasion of Africa, as Valentin Mudimbe has argued, went beyond physical and cartographic demarcations to include a great deal of epistemological colonialism that imposed a standardized Western frame of studying Africa. The tenor of the colonial state and the tenor of the colonial state that combined material conquest and non-material control, I argue, received continuity in the post-colonial regime of power. In the decades following independence, the nascent African radical scholarly community sought to break with Eurocentrism and the structures of the post-colonial state. This was seen as part of the broader struggle for the liberation of the African continent from the jaws of imperialism. Within this radical frame, Ngugi wa Thiong'o was perhaps most notable for his suggestion of decolonizing the mind and knowledge production through the use of African languages. But within the broader Pan-African parlance, the dominant scholarly frontier and institutional site was located in a Marxian tradition and the institutional site of the University of Dar es Salaam. And here, several African scholar activists also working along with Afro-Caribbean thinkers like Walter Rodney and Horace Combo. And within that crop of African scholars, radical African scholars, one could name the Egyptian thinker Samir Amin, who until very recently, when he passed away in 2018, was by far the longest surviving and most consistent Marxist scholar committed to the project of emancipatory and revolutionary scholarship. In addition to the University of Dar es Salaam, the Council for the Development of Social Science Research in Africa, CODESRIA, was, and I argue remains, the leading continental-wide site of radical and Pan-African scholarship committed to countering Eurocentrism. CODESRIA has strived to provide the space, the resources, and the inspiration to debate issues of public interest and policy on the continent. The Marxist-inspired focus of CODESRIA inevitably took it down the path of partiality towards political economy, something that some scholars like Ashley Mbembe have protested and tried to resist. But CODESRIA's bias towards Marxism historiography and political economy would be hardly surprising, considering that its founding in 1973, at the height of the Cold War, was at the height of the Cold War and the preeminence of a socialist ideological bent across the African continent. For this group of scholars at independence time, the target of attack and criticism was very easy and unproblematic for both scholars and the holders of state power, because the focus was on imperialism and the target was external. This meant that for the most part, the relationship between the scholar and the state at independence time was unproblematic. Unproblematic as long as the scholar directed the analytical gaze at the external target for criticism and did not focus on the internal political and social questions of the day. As Tandika Mukandawire has pointed out, it was safer to talk about such entities as the center and the periphery without incurring the wrath of any particular potentate. This, of course, was to change in due course of time as it became inevitable that the independent-minded scholar and the public-spirited intellectual would have to turn his focus and direct the aperture of critical inquiry on the new holders of state power, the African independence leaders. The early post-independence consensus centered on popular nationalism and the national question, in which the intelligentsia played an active role. Subsequently, the shift went towards confronting authoritarian nationalism, and in Uganda, in the years after independence, in the few years shortly after independence, scholars and public commentators who were using the transition forum, or the forum of the transition magazine, I should say, soon ran afoul of Prime Minister and later on President Milton Obote. Before long, the editor of Transition, Rajab Nyogi, and the lawyer and politician Abu Mayanja, who wrote for the magazine, were incarcerated, a development that I argue was only one in a turn for the worst. Pressed to comment on the arrest of the two, President Obote reportedly observed that the Ugandan government is not blind to activities of intellectuals, feudalists, landlords, and confusing agents. The scornful reference to critics and intellectuals as confusing agents is something that keen observers of current Ugandan politics will find familiar, as President Museveni has used that phrase quite often. In any event, by the time Obote was overthrown by the military in 1971, the actions of the state's intelligence and security apparatus directed at critics and opponents of the government had wrought a deterioration of the civic sphere and undercut intellectual vitality. The net impact of this was the erosion of the space for intellectual famine critical scholarship, and ultimately the shrinkage of the political arena. The breakdown of Uganda's independence political settlement, as I frame it in the paper, had grave implications for scholarship for the long term. Either one was unequivocally aligned with the nationalist project, which became little more than the use of psychophancy in pursuit of personal power and narrow group interests, or one was an enemy of the state, seen as engaged in treason and therefore had to be incarcerated if he or she did not flee the country. The latter fate fell a number of intrepid intellectuals, including the late Danny Dabudere, whose criticism of Obote's creeping authoritarianism put him at loggerheads with the regime and ended him in prison. Recourse to militarism underpinned Milton Obote's descent into authoritarianism. In so doing, he firmly established and cemented a tradition of militarism the country is yet to exercise and whose legacies inform the current political system. Dragging the military into the realm of otherwise civilian political contestation had the net impact of eroding the relative democracy and pluralism that had taken root in Uganda between 1962 and 1966. Obote had come to rely so much on the coercive action of the state as he tightened his grip on power, with his party largely sidelined. Between 1964 and 1968, Obote's creeping authoritarianism cemented a notorious and corrosive role for the military in national politics. As he increasingly came to rely on coercion and not persuasion, at war with the people of Uganda, whose monarch he had hounded into exile, Obote had set himself and the country up for a tragic descent. Before long, ironically, the very military to which he had come to rely so much overthrew him in January 1971, bringing into force Idi Amin's military fascist regime. The most pronounced strand of militarism in post-independence Uganda was during the Amin era, 1971-1979. From the time of Amin's takeover, the slide toward the culture of militarism became as dramatic as it was tragic. Eventually, of course, as we know, Ugandan exiles assisted by the Tanzanian government did overthrow Idi Amin in April 1979, but factional struggles were rife among the armed forces that constituted the UNLA. The brief return to party politics in 1980 was most inopportune in an environment polluted with militarism and a politically fluid atmosphere. It is instructive that in the period between Amin's ousting and the holding of general elections in December 1980, which was a period of less than 2 years, Uganda had 3 different governments. The last government of these 3, courtesy of a disguised coup on May 12, 1980, went by a rather ominous name of the Military Commission, and which was in charge of organizing the 1980 elections. In any event, the 19 elections, as we know, are believed to have been rigged, which handed Museveni the justification to launch a 5-year guerrilla military campaign, whose culmination was the onset of a military government in 1986, coming on the heels of a military coup in July 1985. Thus, from independence in 1962 to 1986, and throughout to the present, force and violence have constituted the core instruments of governance and control in Uganda. It has been one form of militarism after another. A combination of the structure of politics and the nature of the state, on the other hand, and the idiosyncratic predispositions of successive rulers on the other, has worked to perpetuate a mode of exercising power in Uganda that is decidedly anchored in militarism. Under Museveni's regime, on several occasions, brute force and military power have been put on display, often directed at intimidating civilian institutional processes, as happened, for example, with the military siege on the High Court in Kampala on 16th November 2005, and most recently, the invasion of parliament at the height of the debate over the removal of presidential age limits. Elections are one, quote unquote, in Uganda, not so much on policy persuasion as on the use of force and finance. And as a study of the 2016 elections in which I participated summed up the state of affairs, it underscored the fact that the consent of the governed in Uganda is controlled and secured through manipulation and coercion. Although there hasn't been a resort to the brute force and the macabre use of excessive coercive power that defined the diabolic regimes of Idi Amin and Milton Obote, under the Museveni regime, the Ugandan state and the NRM regime, which are fused and folded into one, the projection of militarism is an overarching feature. Ultimately, there is always a defaulting to the use of force whenever the rulers believe that their hold on power is threatened, or when they perceive that critical commentaries have gone too far in exposing the nakedness of power. It is in this environment that the scholar and the state have to operate, or cooperate, or coexist, or contend. At this point, I want to turn briefly to two illustrative areas that put the issue in perspective, and that is my alma mater, Makerere University, which is actually hosting me, and the question of local publishing as a second problem, as I see it. The state of Makerere University, which is Uganda's premier university, is important in helping us steward the conundrum of knowledge production in an environment of militarism. It is Makerere that can help us to illuminate the dilemmas of scholarship in the context of national politics that is built around militarism, and in a country with a long history of political violence and the rule by the gun rather than civic contestation of ideas and principles. A lot of debates on the political economy of scholarship at Makerere and in Africa more generally tends to focus on the economics of the academy, the financial constraints that scholars face and the resource limitations confronting the university, especially following the austerity measures of the 1980s and 90s. There is no gainsaying the severity and magnitude of the financial dilemma. In many African countries, economic opportunities are limited given that private sectors are too small and cannot generate sufficient resources and opportunities from which non-economic sectors like the academy can benefit. Therefore, for many scholars, the temptation to moonlight and find additional income outside of the university is very high. Unfortunately, what is a real problem of resources and the struggle to complement meager salaries through consulting is often leveled with a big brush stroke of a consultancy culture that supposedly explains the dearth of serious scholarly productivity at Makerere. The reality, I argue, is far more complex than a simple binary between consultancy and scholarship. Researchers and individuals engaged in knowledge production are seldom a priority for many African governments, including the Ugandan one. This means that research is not part of the national budgeting priorities and the long-term planning for the government. And better still, remuneration for university faculty and investing in government funding and mission. This was for long Museveni's and NRM's attitude towards Makerere, which is that funding higher education is not a priority for the government. There is some stuff here about the figures of funding research at Makerere, which I will not go into. But the picture is that funding for Makerere, which we all know has been poor as regards to the government of Uganda. The government's poor record of funding research has to be situated in the context of the neoliberal creed that the NRM wholeheartedly embraced, which threw university education into the uncharted waters of trying to extract money from private and fee-paying students under market-driven curricula, something that has been widely debated, and I will not go too much into its detail. The series of reforms undertaken at the behest of the World Bank and other, quote unquote, development partners did not fundamentally transform the role of the university as an engine of knowledge production through research and innovation. Instead, the focus was on increasing access by more students and making the university pay for the students' education. The new thinking of the 1980s inevitably pushed scholars into the marketplace, as Mahmoud Mamdani has suggested. Within the context of a system of militarism, this also in the private sector, but especially from government ministries and agencies. Considering that in Uganda, the economy is relatively small and the private sector is small as well. Therefore, government is a big source of business, not just for the private sector, but also for scholars interested in undertaking consultancies. In this marketplace of soliciting research, funding, and consultancy, one has to avoid openly taking positions that are critical of or contradict the thinking of the rulers and the extant political establishment. Upon capturing power in 1986, the NRM and its ideologues put up a kind of mirage of openness to constructive criticism and the willingness to engage in intellectual debates, particularly at Makerere University. This was in part because many among the leading commanders of the NRA and even Museveni himself were individuals inspired by the intellectual atmosphere at the University of Dar es Salaam in the 1960s and at Makerere University in the early 1980s. It was thus common for NRM ideologues and activists to participate in public debates at Makerere in the 1990s and early 2000s. I witnessed this myself as a young undergraduate student in the mid-2000s, perhaps in an attempt to show that the military and the civilian public were in harmony and could engage in a critical discourse. Even serving army officers participated in open debates, including on topics that were decidedly political. And more recently, the Department of Political Science, my home department, established a working relationship with the staff and command college of the military in training and providing academic training to officers of the Ugandan Army. However, the top military and political establishment in Uganda has tended to display hostility towards independent-minded thought and academic freedom. This is all the more ironic considering that Museveni's own formative years, which at a minimum had some flirtation with Marxist thought and a consistent practice of intellectual engagement, including through published books. Yet there's evidence of anti-intellectual predisposition by Museveni and his regime. Museveni has been on record, for example, chiding Makerere and its scholars as teaching useless courses. And on one occasion, he challenged the university staff, faculty, who were protesting poor remuneration to instead go rear goats. On many occasions, he has lashed out at eminent scholars at Makerere like Joloko Nyango. And in the words of one retired Makerere scholar, Museveni has a latent intellectualism, yet he is anti-intellectual. For many years, him and his government have had a long-running acrimonious relationship with the Makerere, an affair that reached fever pitch level with the closure of the university in 2016. The university's summarily closure was the worst escalation between the university and the government since the 10th December 1980 shooting of students on the campus. Since 1990, deadly encounters, between Makerere had kind of subsided in recent years. However, there was a growing environment of violent protests at the university starting in the mid-2000s, which coincided with the appointment of a second military general to command the Ugandan police force, General Kale Kaihura. The appointment of a soldier to command the police intensified the militarization of law enforcement. Thus, whenever there was a strike and protest at Makerere, whether by students over tuition fees increment or academic staff demands for salary increment, it was always General Kale Kaihura and not the Minister of Education or the chairperson of the University Council to engage both students and staff in negotiating an end to the standoff. Heavy police and especially military deployments at Makerere became routine over the last 2 decades, often leading to scuffles and shootings. During this period, Makerere had many stripes of militarism on and around the university campus. In the most recent episode of October 2019, there were reports of the military raiding halls of residence at night and engaging in acts of brutality against students who were protesting tuition fees increment at the university. This manner of projecting military might through heavy deployment of police and military forces at Makerere erodes freedom of academia and is contrary to Article 14 of the Kampala Declaration on Intellectual Freedom and Social Responsibility. The endless crises at Makerere, including on and off strikes and staffing problems, are quite instructive. While staff, faculty, and administrators have repeatedly pressed for increased resource allocation from government in a bid to improve remuneration and to meet the university's many financial needs, Museveni and his government have demanded that the university abandons teaching useless courses. By useless courses, of course, Museveni is not referring to useless in the strict functional or technical sense, but rather in a political sense. Museveni knows that one does not need to go to the university to acquire the most basic technical skills and competencies which vocational institutions can provide. What Museveni and the NRM establishment find unsettling is the potential political threat supplied by a university that imparts critical skills and provides a liberal arts experience necessary for informed citizenship, independent-minded thinking, and intellectual vitality. By attempting to stifle civic contribution, the civic contribution made by the university through education and training, and by undermining intellectual freedom through propagating a mostly hostile military attitude, the Museveni regime has in quite significant ways succeeded in disarticulating the university from Ugandan society. The precarious state of Makerere parallels the dilemmas of local publishing, to which I should briefly turn to in a moment. The sum of it with regards to Makerere is that Museveni and indeed the military authoritarian rulers in his mold wants to impose a form of command and control on the functioning of the university, on what scholars pursue in their work, and ultimately on knowledge production, which is contrary to Article 11 of the Kampala Declaration that I alluded to a moment ago. Related to the plight of Makerere is the state of local publishing. Scholarly productivity depends a great deal on the availability of outlets and platforms for independent publishing and dissemination. Local publishing is especially crucial for the flourishing of primary research and the growth of the core citizen intellectuals. In Uganda, the leading local scholarly publishing house for quite some time now has been Fountain Publishers, owned by James Tumsim, I should say. For the most part, when you look at, a casual look at the catalog of Fountain Publishers, published titles, when you look at the catalog of Fountain Publishers, what one will easily find is that the published titles by Fountain Publishers are not any of those that directly tackle critical issues of contemporary national politics and economics. For the most part, works that are critical of the current political establishment or those that raise serious questions about the state of democracy, rule of law, human rights, and social justice in the country are either self-published or published outside Uganda. Quite instructively, when published outside Uganda, the Ugandan intelligence and security agencies have on several occasions attempted to block entry into the country or confiscated copies of books that cast a critical spotlight on the NRM regime and the rule of President Museveni. This was the case most recently with the edited volume on the 2016 elections that is perceptively titled Controlling Consent. Earlier on in 2010, copies of The Correct Line by Olive Kovsinje were confiscated at Entebbe Airport and did not circulate in Uganda until after the elections. So I want to end there. I think I'm out of time by emphasizing that an environment of militarism has a lot of corrosive effect on scholarship, but particularly when we see it through the way a premier university like Makerere is treated by the government, and how scholarship at a premier university like Makerere is navigated. But second, and perhaps no less important, the manner in which publishing at the local level happen or does not happen. And we see this in the way that the leading scholarly publishing house in Uganda, for the most part, has tended to steer clear of titles that are seen as politically controversial, and thus people having to resort to self-publishing, which has all sorts of problems, or publishing from outside the country that comes with its own logistical and practical problems. I believe I went over a bit of the time I had planned to use, but Edgar, I'm going to pause there, and we'll be happy to get some comments and questions from the discussant as well as from the audience. Thank you all for your very kind audience.
Thank you very much for that amazing presentation. I think it gives us a lot to think about and discuss. I'm just a note where I'm getting a number of frantic messages from members who are in various places on campus and can't connect to the internet, or their connections aren't stable. So I wonder if we can discuss later whether recording can be made available to members who aren't able to connect due to technical issues. But for now, I don't know if Zaid Sakito Dr. Sakito is able to connect and offer any comments. Zaid,
thank you very much, Dr. Edgar.
Thank you very much. Can I just mention a word, as I'm sure everyone here knows already, but Zaid has just recently successfully defended his dissertation. So we're happy to introduce Dr. Sakito to give his comments. Thank you. Yes, Zaid, we can see you. I don't think we can hear you.
Seem to have frozen.
Hello.
Yes, we can hear you now.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Edgar, for organizing this presentation, and thanks Associate Professor Moses Khisa for this beautiful presentation. It's beautiful in a sense that it is speaking to the contemporary politics. Beautiful because it's reminding me of Napoleon of power consolidation, where he regulated, controlled, and abolished the teaching of certain disciplines or subjects. Case in point was history, philosophy, literature, on grounds that they do teach political thinking skills, and they do provide a liberal arts experience necessary for informed citizenship, independent-minded thinking, and they do create an environment of intellectual vitality and opposition to state power. How I wish you brought that early enough. I would have liked it so much, but I saw it somewhere. Secondly, the work is beautiful because you use Makerere as one of the key examples, a center of knowledge production. And as a staff of Makerere University, I'm guided by 3 cardinal roles. 1 is teaching, 2 is research, and 3 is community outreach. Teaching leads to research and community outreach. And for someone to become a scholar, he must work with the community. It is the social, political, and economic dynamics within society that do inform scholarship. So at the moment, Khisa's work on the state and the scholar, militarism, and the dilemmas of decolonizing knowledge becomes pertinent. He threads through from the colonial times to the post-colonial times, although he gives little emphasis on the colonial times, where he talks about the colonialism learned by use of coercion, force, and it maintained itself by use of force, where they used 2 strategies, one of which was the mercenary technique, using soldiers which were not related or affiliated to any particular group. Here, I wish you gave us an example, for example, of the Nubians who were used as mercenaries at some point in time. This would have been very, very pertinent. Your emphasis has so much been on the Museveni era, and it is understandable. And from one as a Democrat and another one as a product of militarism, and therefore there to sustain himself by military means. Whom you have cited, office of the president, by way of creating a person of force. This is my army. And as such, this has been entrenched within society, within the some were, of course, surprised when in the recent past, a major general was made the Minister for Education. I don't know whether that one skipped your mind, but which then informs the processes that lead processes, institutions, and the agendas, the military agendas that would militate then against scholarship. You define militarism as subordinating of societal processes, institutions, and agendas to the objectives of the military, and in this we see even the use of force. So, and your argument is that the superiority of militarism has inhibited the deepening of a tradition of independent scholarship. The deepening of but not deepen. Not because the pairing up with the state to teach military courses in Kimaka places. Kimaka, you can also put.
Hello, Zaid. I think your connection is freezing a bit.
Maybe if he turned off the video feature, he would be able to use the audio alone, then the connection might be better and stable if he turned off.
I think so.
Yeah. Did we lose him?
Hello?
Yeah, but they
Yes.
turn off the video feature so you can use the audio alone. We've been losing you and the connection is quite poor.
Okay, okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. So I was saying that
if you can back up,
your mother.
We lost you there for a while. If you can back up for like a minute.
Yes. So
Okay.
I was saying that you cite your department, which is political science, as one of those departments that have paired up with, for example, the state to ensure that there is the state academia relation by way of them going to teach in the military academy in the Kimaka. However, those who are anti-government policies have been sidelined. However influential, however informed, however knowledgeable they are, for as long as they are not pro-state, they have actually been sidelined. Now, if decolonizing knowledge requires an enabling environment, this environment probably is lacking in an institution like Makerere. For example, given the poverty that we do have here, there is bureaucracy that surrounds the research clearance process, where whether I'm a Ugandan or an American, I am required to pay $300, which is equivalent to 1.something million to get cleared so that I can go ahead and do research. But that is not the end. I have to go on and acquire clearance from the Ugandan National Council for Science and Technology. If I'm not East African, I'm required to pay $300 again. And if I am a Ugandan or East African, I pay $50. Then it doesn't stop there. If I'm a critical scholar who is attacking the position of the state, my work has to go to the president's office and it has to be cleared from there. I think this is something that you have missed out, and I would actually love to see that you do put it there. Decolonizing knowledge production, and in this case, you are reflecting on the research clearance process. This itself has made the state, the military regulate scholarship, made the military regulate scholarship. I talked about also the question of the Minister of Education, Jessica Lupo, one time. We don't know whether she was at one time, or she is a product of education, but became the Minister for Education. But by the mere fact that this was a retired, this was a major general, this is military. We talked about what did to the students from Makerere, creating an environment, a fear-like environment that made even though the potential scholars to desist from probably writing what they did. And so was the question. During that time, many people actually feared to reach out to Jessica Arupo on the ground that she was a soldier, and that also very good as it is, there are some aspects that help us bring in to enrich it further. For example, There is the work by Kaitesi, China, child soldier fighting for my life. China Kaitesi as one person who had been, who got recruited into NRA rebel forces at the age of, was raped and re-raped several times, and came up to the point of writing out her experience. And says from the 1990s, the official army turned out in writing, but the moment Kaites put this in writing, he was forced into exile. I don't know whether this can be regarded as scholarship. If it can be regarded as scholarship, then this is an example also. Kaites portrays Museveni, whom we have mentioned several times, portrays him as a heartless rebel. Heartless in the sense that he did not think, did not mind the people, the citizens, the civilians at that time, and did not mind even the soldiers he was fighting against, and has never minded against those he claimed he was fighting for. And you have mentioned it, that he said, I came by the power of the gun and I'll go by the power of the gun. And it's implication that the institution of elections is a useless institution that did not put him into power and therefore cannot get him out of power. So these unprogressive forces have also been pointed out, like also when you look at Khisa message, but in the most recent version, he edited them out because they were attacking the militant of the state on scholarship and other aspects through the use of African languages. Indeed, it was a beautiful piece. However, I'd request, if possible, you compliment Uduwa work with Rose Mokama's changing can memory and that
So I think we've lost you again, Zaid.
that militarization in Africa.
Seems we've lost him again. So
maybe he can log off and then come back. Perhaps the connection will be better. So Edgar, you propose perhaps go to Q&A, and then I can respond at once. So what do you propose?
sure, however you'd like to do it. Zaid, he's put a number of things on the table. I think that we'll come back to. I might amplify one that he mentioned in passing about, when he was mentioning community engagement, but also our role at Makerere as teachers, primarily. It's where we spend most of our time, and what you make of that role. And maybe other members have thoughts about how our teaching connects to these broader issues of that have been raised in the presentation. However you'd like to do it. There's a question already in the chat, and someone else has raised their hand. Would you like to take those and respond at once, or say a few words?
Yeah, I think I would be keen to hear a lot more from folks out there. So any questions or comments, and then I'll take them in one swoop if time allows. So I think it's better we allow people to comment or raise questions before I can speak later.
Sure, that's great. So I think Milton Wabiona had asked to ask a question.
Thank you so much, Dr. Edgar, and thank you, Dr. Khisa. My name is Milton, and I'm very happy to hear from you. You taught me at CBR about over 10 years ago, and so excited about this presentation. This was really fantastic. Thank you.
Thanks.
I was so intrigued by your observation of Mamdani's dichotomy of the scholarship and public intellectual, which I think actually is, according to me as well, as much as you discussed it, is the core of the dilemma of decolonizing knowledge in Africa. Because I feel we have failed to get that balance, the relevance against the excellence. At some point, maybe the scholarship has focused more on the excellence and ignored the part of the relevance, which has not played in the decolonization campaign. Because what has happened is what I feel we keep on talking to ourselves. Yeah. Who else here as us in Africa? How many intellectuals are there? So in your research, I hope that you will go further, or do you intend to go further to seek those approaches that will strike that balance between excellence and relevance in order to take knowledge to the greater African community in the manner and form that they best understand it, other than because you have actually explained how publication in Africa is such a huge problem. So if all the knowledge is published and is only kept in those published houses, which are non-accessible to Africans, then we are still not decolonizing anything yet. I want to relate your study to one that I am actually doing, my own study. I am doing a PhD in music education. And in my research, I actually found out that the only specialized music teacher preparation program that was in Uganda was actually closed by the government in 1987. And following that, also the entire teachers' college was closed by government until it was taken over by the Catholic Church and operated as the first privately operated teachers training college. So your study is so pertinent to the times, and I think I'm very, very interested in reading that in much more detail once you share it out. And I think I will also personally reach out to you for more of the sources that you have shared in this study to enrich my own debate. Thank you so much. And thank you so much, Dr. Edgar, for organizing this.
Thank you very much for that comment and question. Moses, there's another question in the chat that I don't know if Bernard Wabukala would like to.
I don't know whether he wants to voice it or I will just address it when I speak.
Sure, just for the benefit of those who haven't seen it, it's a question about is there a relationship between militarism and economic prosperity? This is one of the claims of a lot of developmentalist authoritarian governments, is that a kind of militaristic approach to society enables investment and economic growth, and wondered what is I think the question is getting at what's your reflection on that claim.
Hello?
Yes.
Yeah. Edgar is fine. Moses can just go on and share his thoughts on that. I'm listening in. Thanks.
Thank you. Yep.
All right.
So would you like to take on that set of questions, and then we can take, if you have time, we could do one more round.
Sure. So let me begin with Bernard's question about militarism or the military and economic growth, economic prosperity. So as political scientist, I do appreciate the role of military organizing and the role of, violence in development. This is not anything unique to Uganda. World over, states and societies have prospered and transformed with the active role of military institutions. And so what I'm criticizing here really is not the idea of the military and the military institution and whether or not it is a good thing. I'm not making a normative argument about the place of the military in society. I am making an empirical argument about the problems of militarism, which is different from having a military institution or a set of military institutions that are important for society. We all need national defense, we need national security. And there's a way that military organizing is critical to mobilizing national consensus, national cohesion, and developing a set of national ethos that are important for socioeconomic transformation. That is without any question. The problem is when the military and military power are, placed as the overarching source and symbol of authority. When you have, militarism all over in parliament, at a university like Makerere and so on and so forth. My interest here specifically is in what does that mean for knowledge production, and particularly for decolonizing knowledge, which I see as entailing raising critical questions that challenge the status quo. So the aspect of the economy that Bernard has spoken to, it's debatable the extent to which the Ugandan military history comes into play here. We know that there has been relative growth and prosperity in Uganda, in part because the country has been relatively peaceful. Peaceful, of course, we have to use that advisedly. It's not that, peace and tranquility have been uniform in Uganda over the last more than 3 decades. But I think if you're thinking about the long term, militarism is actually antithetical to many things, not just knowledge production. It's also antithetical to long-term economic transformation. Because, see, a militaristic system is untenable. It's bound to create all sorts of problems. We see how the Ugandan political situation has been deteriorating in the last few years. And part of the deterioration is because we still have a system where the holders of power base their power on the gun, not on their ability to appeal and persuade the public in a civil manner. And so if somebody is counting on military force as the pillar of Uganda's economic transformation, that military force has to be accountable to a civilian public for it to be sustainable. If it is not, assuming that it is true, as some people may argue, that Uganda's military prowess has played a role in our socioeconomic transformation, assuming that were true, my write up that would be that it's untenable, unsustainable for the long term if things don't change in a direction where we can have military institutions without having militarism. I think that's sort of the analytical distinction I am making. And then, Edgar, your question, which, as you rightly pointed out, was also raised by Zaid about community engagement and teaching in the university. As a teacher, I value scholarship and service. I value research, but also knowledge dissemination and knowledge sharing. And I think this point also touches on Milton's question about the binary, Mamdani's binary of relevance and excellency. And as I argue in the paper, it's not either or, right? It's not either teaching or community engagement. It's not either excellency or relevance. It's both, because one has to speak to the other, and one in many ways is dependent on the other. There is a symbiotic relationship there. There is an important feedback loop between the scholar as a teacher and as a servant of the public. And I have, in my other writings, made the argument that, the university is not a university without it having a relationship with the wider public. When scholars speak to themselves in the iron walls of the university, they are not doing a service to themselves, actually. They are doing a disservice to not just the community, they're doing a disservice to themselves. And so, Mamdani's rather false binary of, the public intellectual and the scholar, to me, is completely meaningless. You cannot purport to be an excellent scholar if you don't have relevance in society, and if your scholarship does not speak to the key, doubting questions of the day. And so, I think if you asked me from a normative philosophical point of view, we all, as scholars, have a service to pay to the public. We have a duty to the public. Many of us were educated by the Ugandan taxpayer. We haven't actually quite paid back. We pay back by teaching, but we need to do more, right? We need to speak to the issues of the public and be a voice of the voiceless in many ways. And so, I firmly believe in the genre of a scholar activist who is involved in the rough and tumble of the social and political world. And I think that, Makerere is a very important institutional site for that kind of undertaking. And that's why the Museveni government has striven so hard to, control Makerere and do all sorts of things that inhibit a free atmosphere of engagement and Makerere's participation in the actual issues that affect Uganda. But Zaid's other comments on other colonial territories, perhaps I should, respond to his point about the IRB process in Uganda, the politics of the research clearance by the Uganda National Council of Science and Technology. I've been there, so I know what he's talking about, and I have a very vivid and instructive experience that I one time encountered when I was beginning to do my project, mine and my colleagues with whom we're working on the military and civil military relations in Uganda. We applied for clearance, for IRB clearance, and I appeared at an IRB board somewhere, which I will not mention, and I was to present the proposal in PowerPoint. I had already, shared the detailed proposal with the board members, and when I was called in to make the presentation, they actually told me I cannot present because from the title of the project that I and colleagues were planning to do, they as an IRB board were not able to make a decision on that matter. In fact, they pretty much blatantly told me that this kind of topic has to be cleared by State House, by the office of the president. I think they said it has to be cleared by the office of the president. And I was mad. I said, the office of the president has to clear this topic. Then what's the business of the Uganda National Council of Science and Technology and you who sit as an IRB committee? Anyway, so I take note of Zaid's point about IRB. I think it's a terrible thing in many respects, not just the financial cost that Zaid rightly pointed out, but also the difficulty that somebody is going to encounter when they are researching a topic that the rulers don't want to be researched. And so that also, of course, speaks in the wider environment that I am addressing here. Now, let me say final, Edgar, and then I'll toss it back to you. There are many things that Zaid is raising here, and I think other folks, including Milton, was speaking to, which I cannot address in this one short paper. It's supposed to be about 8,000 words. I have a long-standing interest in exploring this project of knowledge production, but particularly the history of ideas as well. And I hopefully will take on some of these issues going forward. Because these are very important points which I cannot be able to cover in detail in the current short paper, but definitely worthwhile thinking about going forward. So Edgar, I think if there are other questions, we may take a few more minutes.
Sure, that would be fantastic if you're available.
Sure, I am.
Just add on to that, the recent visa regulations published a few weeks ago state that non-Ugandans coming to do research, in addition to the $300 IRB and $300 UNCST fees, will also pay a $700 special visa fee. So it's just further evidence of the commercialization of research. It's going on. Are there other questions from members? You can either put it in the chat or raise your hand. Yes, Dr. Rudabajuka. We aren't hearing you. Maybe Simon, we aren't hearing you. Maybe if you're able to put the question in the chat, I could ask it if that's a possibility. Maybe in the meantime, while he's figuring that out, I'd like to add actually a question that I believe Zaid mentioned it as well, this issue of, thinking about militarism as a unitary project. It struck me as a very sort of Crawford Young argument about the breaking of rocks. But there's also, indirect rule created internal divisions and a military class, some have argued. I wonder what I think this intersects with the question of decolonizing knowledge, because those who were recruited into the colonial military were often also excluded from centers of learning, even if it was a colonial education. So even to this day, the numbers of students at Makerere from, I believe, from northern and eastern Uganda are fewer than those from central and western. And this is a direct legacy of colonial recruitment policies and employment. So I wonder what you make of this issue about the production, not just of external mercenaries, but of internal divisions between who is it who gets to view the military as a source of advancement, and who gets to view education as a source of advancement. And that's often independent of who is in power at any specific moment. And just wondered if you, what do you think of that? I don't know if Simon, if you're able to, it shows you're unmuted, but we don't hear you, so. So maybe then I think if I could, there's one other thing maybe that I think is related to what you were discussing about research and teaching, that's a source of debate within the college here about, our for dissertations and for other publications, our PhDs are required to provide a section of recommendations, and there's an emphasis on relevance. So what counts as relevant? And I think often it's not a direct instruction, but it's implied that what's relevant should be not necessarily, it can be an academic recommendation, but if it's situated in either recommendation to government or to civil society, I think many of the times it's framed in a way that we're encouraged to make those claims rather than other academic claims. And it's a source of debate here, because on one hand, those recommendations are often very valuable. On the other hand, they're not always within, a strictly academic setting. So I wonder if you could take that. I'm sorry, Simon, that the audio doesn't seem to be working.
So Edgar, as we wait on Simon, I can quickly say that I actually find that policy or practice very, very problematic. The idea that somehow in an academic product, academic output like a dissertation, that somehow there has to be some policy relevant recommendations that the scholar is making. This is, and Makerere has had this problem for a long time, and many African universities have this kind of problem. There is, when we speak about the scholar being relevant and contributing to the wider public good, we need to be careful not to be mechanistic and think that somehow, when I write a paper like this, I must give bullet points of what are the policy relevant implications of what I'm saying. See, knowledge production and ideas go far beyond that kind of simplistic, mechanistic prescription that we're being told to do, that students, for example, are told to do right now. And so, that section of the dissertation that's supposed to be, policy recommendations or whatever, it's somebody needs to think more innovatively about how to do that. I mean, I'm entirely for, work having, implications that are of a practical and social nature. That's fine, but it doesn't have to be done in a very, I don't know, sort of fixated fashion, So we because I think, the humanities and social sciences are critical in providing ideas and in providing, intellectual stimulation to society. We have to stay focused, I think, on that as the primary goal for us as scholars. And to the extent that, scholarly intervention helps in framing important national questions, sure, excellent. But that somehow we have to be reduced to, the status of being authors of bullet point policy recommendations. Fine. I mean, I see where that's coming from too. I mean, okay, there's some research that scholars do, which is, policy research. Fine. You can engage in policy relevant research or policy focused research, or what some people call, action research, whatever. But we cannot lose focus of, primary research and basic research for what it is worth. That is the primary focus of the scholar. And if I was advising a PhD student at Makerere, I would be very reluctant to have to impose on them the requirement that what they are doing must show that it's relevant in a policy sense, or that there have to be recommendations that are actionable. I think that there's a lot of that kind of stuff that other people are doing. I would not impose that requirement on a young scholar at Makerere who is working through their scholarship in the formative stages. And then, Eddie, I think your question about the long durée of the military and the divisions that were created by the colonial state that produced, the track of progress, social mobility through military means, and how that plays out in today's times. I think, seen from that lens of, if you like, class divisions within the military, but also connected to society, we see quite a bit of that still, on play today. And therefore, I think what I'm saying is I agree with your observation, and that's the kind of thing that if I took on a bigger long-term project on this subject, I would be interested in taking that aspect up as well.
Thank you for that thoughtful response. I see that it looks like Simon was able to unmute. I don't know if he has a question, we can take it before we wrap up, or. It seems like it may not be working, so.
Okay, so I have a couple of questions here, which are quite direct questions in the chat, and I'll respond to them. So Priscilla Asimire, I hope I got the last name correct. Some of the names in southwestern Uganda tend to cause me problems pronouncing them. So I hope, Priscilla, I hope I got that right. Priscilla Asimire. She's asking me, as a matter of my curiosity, was your other study letter approved by the Office of the President, or was it not approved? So the study I was talking about, I mean, it was a very strange situation that I had to deal with. The simple answer, Priscilla, that I would like to give is that we actually went ahead with the study because we had succeeded in getting some green light from the military hierarchy, and they were willing to have us, interview them, but in a very restricted manner. I mean, in the end, they sort of, gave us some concessions, but not everything we had wanted. We had wanted to do a much bigger survey of the UPDF and ask some questions about, certain things we're interested in learning, but we were not able to do that. But we did get some cooperation, which I really appreciate, from the Chief of Defense Forces and other members of the UPDF leadership. And so I and my colleagues were able to do some work. We did not get clearance from the Office of the President, but I guess, the military hierarchy does work with the Office of the President. And so so they gave us some support, some minimal support. And things worked out, at least to a certain extent, with the work that we were trying to do. And then Milton has asked me a personal question, considering your rather critical view of the state, how much has that influenced your choices as a Ugandan scholar, including the choice of your workstation? Milton, I have to say that, I know I signed up to being a scholar, and I have to be true to my conscience and do the work that I think I should do, and speak out when I believe I have to speak out. And so I currently work in the United States, but this has nothing to do with the fact that I wouldn't want to work in Uganda. As a matter of fact, I have to say that, I was supposed to be employed at Makerere, and I definitely look forward to returning home sometime soon.
Thank you, Moses, for those responses, and everyone who has participated today. It's been a really, I think, useful and rich discussion from your work, which we're all looking forward to seeing in print relatively soon. I can say as one of the editors. So this has been really, I think, useful and I think productive in a way that's cross-disciplinary, that brings a our historical lens to questions from political science and politics. So with that, I would just like to thank you. I hope that you'll be able to be here in person sometime soon. But one of the, I think, few advantages of this pandemic is that we've been able to connect with colleagues around the world electronically, even when travel isn't possible. So we hope that this pandemic will be in the rearview mirror soon, so we can do this in person. So thank you to everyone. One question, maybe we can discuss this on email later, Moses, is that there are a few people who were unable to join for technical reasons and wondered if they might get a recording. But we can see if that's feasible. Maybe discuss that.
I'm fine with sharing the recording. This is
Right.
Part of decolonizing knowledge is not restricted. So I don't believe in people patenting things and saying, oh, don't record it. When you record it, don't distribute the recording. I'm a very open person, and so sharing the recording is perfectly fine. Let those who were not able to catch the presentation live at least be able to get it via the recording. So that's perfectly fine with me, Edgar.
That would be fantastic. Thanks so much for that.
Sure.
And with that, just on behalf of the department, thank you for presenting. Thank you to Zaid for the comments and discussion. And our next scheduled presentation isn't until June with Richard Reed. We will be having some internal meetings with our doctoral students on their dissertations. But the next public presentation that we have scheduled is June, I believe the last week of June, with Dr. Richard Reed. And we have, I believe, 3 others who will be presenting shortly after them. So please watch on Twitter and on our email lists for those announcements. In the meantime, thank you to everyone. And yes, did you?
No, just to say.
We just hope to see you again soon. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Edgar, for organizing this, and I really appreciate everybody who turned up, and thanks for the kind comments and for the questions. I greatly appreciate everything.
Thanks so much. Goodbye, everyone.
Okay, bye.